Welcome to the March 9th meeting of the British Empire Study Group. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, thank you. And for our regulars, thank you very much. I will enable the chat shortly. I just only have two hands. So the British Empire Study Group is, we're pretty liberal with the definition of British Empire. It flew over it, went through it, came from it. Everything's fair game. So without further ado, I am going to go and turn it over to my cohort, Robert Lutens, to introduce Chris Dorn. And he's going to have to, someone's going to have to explain that that nickname for Chris, because I'm dying to hear what that is. So Robert, if you could take it away.
Okay, thank you, Joan. A few words about tonight's program. The triangular stamps of the Cape of Good Hope are among the most iconic in philately. Issued on the 1st of September in 1853, they were the world's first triangular stamps. They've been sought after by collectors ever since the hobby of stamp collecting began in the 19th century. This evening's presenter, Chris Dorn, is, among other things, a moderator for the philatelic website, the Stamp Forum. A few years ago, some of the Stamp Forum archive material on the Cape of Good Hope triangles was in danger of being lost. Alarmed by such a possibility, Chris began familiarizing himself with those stamps and the available literature. What began as an archival preservation has since become one of his collecting passions, culminating in a technical article about the Cape of Good Hope triangles, published in September of 2022 in the Cape and Natal Philatelic Journal, with hopefully more articles to come in the future. Chris intends to build on the seminal work of David Allen Stevenson. He was a lighthouse engineer from the famous Scottish lighthouse builder family and a noted amateur philatelist. In 1951, Stevenson was awarded the Crawford Medal by the Royal Philatelic Society of London for his work, The Triangular Stamps of the Cape of Good Hope. Chris's goal is to systematically link Stanley Gibbons catalog identifications to properly certified examples of these stamps, only including results from expertising organizations specifically experienced with the Cape Triangles. Chris will share highlights from his philatelic and professional backgrounds, how he came to learn about Cape Triangles, online resources for identifying genuine stamps from forgeries, and how to apply other resources for proper ID. His approach to identification can be applied to other collecting areas as well. A specialization or deep interest in the Cape of Good Hope is not required to appreciate the techniques that Chris has developed. Here's some background on Christopher Dorn, our presenter this evening. He was born in the United States Midwest, graduated from Massachusetts Institute of Technology with Bachelor of Science degrees in chemistry and French language and literature, served 4 years on active duty in the United States Marine Corps, worked as a materials engineer, international sales and marketing manager, and facilities managing director in the commercial beryllium metal industry for over 30 years. More recently employed in fusion energy research. Lived and worked in France and the United Kingdom for most of the past 5 years. Started worldwide stamp collecting as a youth in the mid-1960s, specialized in pre-1940 classic era stamps by the early 1990s, joined the Stamp Forum in November of 2016, became a moderator in 2020. He's written nearly 20 articles for the Stamp Forum newsletter from 2017 to date, including one about gaining philatelic expertise using online resources. He's a member of the American Philatelic Society and the Cape and Natal Study Circle. So without further ado, I give you tonight's presenter, our friend, Chris Dorn.
Well, thanks for that, Rob. Gosh, I'm looking around thinking, who is it who is it you're describing there that did all that stuff? So, hi everyone, I'm Chris. I'm gonna go ahead and try to share my screen here and hopefully get the presentation up. Let's see. So now I'm sharing, and let's see if the How's that look, Joan and Rob? Can you see that okay?
Looks good, Chris.
Perfect.
All right, excellent. Well, as it happens, so by means of introduction, I'm going to just say that I'm a collector of many things. So not just stamps. I've got that collecting gene. And so one of the other things that I like to collect besides stamps is quotes. And I always like to begin every presentation that I make with a quote from my collection. And one of my favorites is one that I discovered a few years ago when I was living in Europe. And it's from the famous French fashion designer, Coco Chanel, who famously once said, "I only drink champagne on two occasions, when I am in love and when I am not." And so I don't necessarily have that much in common with old Coco there, but what I can say is I only talk about the Cape Triangles on two occasions, when I'm presenting for the BESG and when I am not. So, which means that I like to talk about it quite a lot. So anyway, all right, so let us go on to the look at the presentation outline here. And basically this is just, I'm not going to spend any time on this slide. It's just mainly to show how the presentation is organized and what I'm going to be covering. And if anybody really wants a copy of the presentation file after I'm done, I'm happy to supply those to people. So that's
Chris?
no problem. Yes.
Hey, I am so sorry. Could you move your little stop sharing, the little stop sharing thing out of the way,
Oh.
just grab and drag? Because I'd love to see all your sides.
Okay.
Or just
if I
hide,
hit,
or just
if I
hide
hit,
it.
if I hit hide, does that
That's
work okay?
perfect. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Sorry.
No problem.
It didn't occur to me that that would also be shared. So I thought maybe that was just for me, but okay. Anyway, no problem. So yeah, so this is the presentation outline. So this is the material we're going to be covering. And so without any further ado, and those are just a few of my Cape Triangles there on the right. These are the Perkins Bacon printings. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the whole thing. So by means of introduction, so Rob already gave a really nice introduction, and thank you for that. But there's a couple of things I want to cover also in this part, again, to sort of tell a little bit about how I got into it, but also just to kind of make my position clear. So for my opening disclaimer, as it is, basically, I just want to be sure that you all understand that the information that I'm giving you is correct to the best of my knowledge, but a lot of it is my opinion. And so I try to be very honest about that. And and I think just like so many things in life, there's a difference between fact and opinion. And good opinions are based on fact, but they're still just opinions. And so I just want to be sure that everybody understands that the things that I'm going to be saying, these are my opinions. And so does it mean that I think I'm right? Of course it does. I mean, that's my opinion. But it doesn't mean that I can't, if I can find evidence to the contrary, I can change my opinion. So anyway, I just want to be a little bit clear about that for starters. And so, just a little bit more of my philatelic history. I've been very indecisive over the years about specializing, and I started out collecting as a kid, and just everything, worldwide everything was kind of my mantra back in the 60s and 70s. And so if it was a stamp, I collected it. Simple as that. And and I could never really decide easily about specializing. So I finally did, as Rob mentioned in the intro, a little bit back in the 90s, I started to specialize in US stamps for a while, but I got kind of bored with those. But eventually I settled on collecting just the classics, and I still consider myself a worldwide classics collector, more than a specialist in Cape Triangles or anything else. But I was always very wary of the forgeries, and once I learned about the fact that the Cape Triangles had been heavily forged, I stayed away from them. And for, a very long time, I had a grand total of one in my collection that I bought at auction, and I basically paid catalog value for it from from a reputable dealer at the time. This was back in the 90s. And and I was basically intimidated and didn't want to, try to buy any other Cape triangles because I was afraid that, I would get taken in. And so then while I was on the stamp forum, and you'll be hearing a lot about the stamp forum tonight too, since I'm a member, and I became a moderator a few years ago, and it's the place where I did my first philatelic writing. I ask, well, was it a perfect storm that I stumbled into the stamp forum in the first place? It wasn't anything. I've never been real active on social media. It wasn't anything I was really looking to do. I stumbled into it by accident and, kind of ended up finding a home there. And so then I started with the philatelic writing when I was encouraged to do that. And so just all of these kind of little steps have over the last several years have just led me down this path. And then as Rob mentioned, there was a specific thing that happened with a former member of the forum who had posted a lot about the Cape Triangles and some really good images and stuff. But he was offended by something that happened on the forum, and so he decided, as sort of retribution for that, to just leave. But in so doing, he decided to delete all of his posted images and took them with him. And so I had just become a moderator a little bit before that time. And so once that happened, I was devastated because I was really enjoying the Cape Triangle thread that we had going at the time. But it was gutted because all those great images were gone. So I made it my personal project to try to replace those. And so I started out by searching online, because I didn't have much in the way of Cape Triangles in my collection at that point. Still just had that one. And so I started searching online based on the descriptions and things in the posts, and I started finding things, and eventually I started to be able to see the differences from one stamp to the next, and things like that. So eventually in 2021, I wrote an article about digital learning called With or Without Stamps, that was published in the TSF newsletter back then. And then, as Rob mentioned, and what got me the gig here tonight, is that I wrote an article about the Cape Triangles last year that got published. And so then I got invited to give this presentation. So now you're going to be hearing more about all of that. So a little bit of a brief overview on the triangle. So, as Rob had also mentioned in the introduction, they're the world's first triangular stamps, and also the first postage stamps issued in Africa, which I hadn't really realized. And the history is actually pretty well documented. So there's in 1930, a book was published, authored by a guy named Alice, and it was published actually by Stanley Gibbons, and that talks about Cape of Good Hope philately in a much broader sense. So not just about triangles, but about the rectangular issues and postmarks and postal history and other stuff too. So, and that's quite a good book, and I was able to get a couple of little tidbits out of there for my article. The main one that everybody, kind of refers to and knows about is the Stevenson book. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later in the presentation, but that was published in 1950. And Stevenson covers quite a lot about the history of Cape philately and how that led up to the creation of the triangles. And there is this famous, I don't know if all of you have ever heard of this famous story of Stanley Gibbons and the so-called sea bag, what I call the sea bag acquisition. And if you see the illustration there on the right, that's a sketch of a a sailor there with a I'll see if I can get the cursor. Okay, there's the cursor. So there's the sailor there that with his sea bag, and you can see all these little triangles falling out of the sea bag onto the counter there at the Gibbons chemist shop. And there's old Stanley at his dad's chemist shop. And these sailors had been to the Cape of Good Hope, and apparently the story goes that they had won some kind of a local raffle, and in winning this raffle, they ended up with a sack full of Cape triangles, thousands of them apparently, and so they brought them to Stanley Gibbons, and Gibbons gave them £5 for the whole sack full, which was a lot of money back in the 1860s or so when this would have happened, I think. And it was a lot of money back then, and the sailors, I think had spent maybe a shilling or two for their raffle tickets. So I think they were well pleased with their £5. But the story goes that Gibbons was still selling triangles from that original stock into the 1930s. That's my understanding. So anyway, so it's a good story. I don't know if it's how much of it is really true, but it's a very good story, and just kind of adds a little bit to the to the luster of the Cape Triangles, I think. And along the historical lines, there have been more recent books and articles as well. I won't go into those in too many details, but if you get my article, you get a copy of my article and you look in the bibliography, I've got almost every book and article I could track down about the Cape Triangles listed there in the back in the bibliography. So, and one of the things you need to know that sort of complicates the issue with identifying the Cape Triangles correctly is the fact that there were two printers. And there's a whole story behind this as well, which I won't go into too much depth on it, but basically the original designer and printer, Perkins Bacon, eventually they lost the contract and were replaced by Delarue. And so one of the challenges is that you've got stamps that have been printed by two different printers who use different kinds of ink and different kinds of printing methods. The paper was actually the same. Some people seem to think that they can see, major differences in the paper between the two, but in fact, Perkins Bacon was required by the Crown agents to turn over all the original paper, which they had either made or procured. They were required to turn that over to Delarue when they lost the contract. So it's actually the same paper. Stevenson speculates in his book that Delarue may have done some polishing of the surface of the paper to make it appear a bit different, and for it to affect the ink absorption differently as well. But it is in fact the same paper. That anchor watermark paper is the same. The inks undoubtedly were different. The printing methods also different. And the thing that we just have to remember, it's maybe a little hard for us to think about it because it was so long ago compared to where we are now, nearly 175 years ago. There was just a high degree of variability and variation in the process. And so that, as we're going to see as we go through the identification part, leads to trouble with identification of stamps. So coming back a little bit, to the whole resource thing and all of that, and sort of the broader story, how do we gain, as philatelists and collectors, how do we gain knowledge about these things? Well, I mean, a good place to go, are, trusted sources. So people that and recommendations from other knowledgeable collectors and things like that. But, I guess the question is, do you just blindly accept whatever you're told? If somebody tells you, hey, this is the way it is, do you just accept that? Or are there times when, you may want to challenge the status quo, or, just because somebody says, hey, this is the way we've always done it, or this is the place where we get all our information from, does it mean that there aren't other places where you could be getting it? And, nowadays, we have a lot of advantages, over what, Stevenson had back in, 1950. And so, why not use some of those? So, on the traditional side, you've got the major, all the major worldwide stamp catalogs, of course, list Cape Triangles. Two really good books that I've mentioned, Alice and Stevenson, those two books, excellent resources and lots of good information in those, but we have to remember that they are dated, and they were state of the art when they were published, I'm certain, but state of the art has moved on a bit. And we also have auction catalogs, which are another nice resource where you can see pictures of stamps with certificates and good provenance and stuff like that. So that's another one. And if you look at the illustration there, the one on the right, the Sir Maxwell Joseph collection, probably the greatest Cape Triangle collection ever put together. That's got some really good information in there if you take a look through it as well. So that's also a helpful resource. But these days, collectors are looking more for online stuff, and so I want to mention that there's some really good resources out there website-wise. One of my favorites is the Big Blue 1840 to 1940 stamp blog run by Jim Jackson, and I saw that Jim's in our audience tonight, so I'm glad that he's here. Jim's published many blog articles about the Cape Triangles, really good stuff. And there's two really good sites also for trying to tell forgeries from genuine. One's just called Stamp Forgeries, and the other is called Classic Stamp Forgeries. And both of those are really good. I highly recommend them. And I also recommend, the web-based stamp communities. So like the Stamp Forum, of course, I'm partial to that one since that's the one that I'm a member of, but other ones like Stamp Boards and Stamp Bears, and there's Stamp Community Forum, and there's a whole bunch. Virtually all of them have, threads and information about Cape Triangles, and it's a place where you can also, tap into other knowledgeable collectors. So this slide is also, really more of an outline slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the bullet points that you see there. But this is mainly to show you how the main part of my presentation is going to be organized, where we talk about the challenges and steps to get a proper identification of a Cape Triangle. And so I'll talk about all of those bullet points in more detail, but I also just want to point out this is a very nice one of those stamp forgeries websites that I mentioned called Classic Stamp Forgeries. It's a blog site run by a guy named Ron Marlowe. I don't personally know Ron, but there's some fantastic stuff on his site, and he's got at least one article about Cape Triangles on there. And in that is this great image, which points out quite a number of the genuine features that you should be looking for when you're trying to determine whether or not you have a genuine or a forged example. All right, so getting into the nuts and bolts here a little bit. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the genuine versus forgery portion of it and how to do that, because personally I can see it. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but for the rest of you, I'm not really, I don't consider myself an expert in forgeries by any means. And the sites that I mentioned, like the Classic Stamp Forgeries or the Stamp Forgeries, there's a ton of really good information on there, and especially that Classic Stamp Forgeries, Ron Marlowe. He really is an expert about the forgeries, and he can, quote all the different, who the different forgers were and identify the specific forgeries and stuff, which is, kind of way beyond what I can do. And to be honest, it's beyond my interest. I'm interested in the genuine triangles and identifying those. So it's clear that the first step needs to be making sure that you have a genuine article, in your hands for proper identification. But once I get to that point, you know, I don't really care all that much which forger did it or anything like that. And so, and in fact, I actually don't even have any forgeries in my collection because I haven't needed them. Once I figured out that you know, how to identify them online, and I could see the difference, there wasn't any need to, you know, build up a reference collection of forgeries. So I didn't bother to do that. But normally you should be able to get them online reasonably inexpensively. Occasionally you'll see some strange seller who will claim a really rare forgery and want a lot of money for it. But most of the time, the asking prices for those things are comparable to what you'd pay for a genuine stamp. So I figure, why would I want it? So anyway, so in this particular example here, the one on the left here, this is a genuine example, and the one on the right here, this is one of the very common Spiro forgeries, Spiro or Spiro, I guess, S-P-I-R-O, and anyway, this is the one you'll see the most often. So anyway, that's just a basic, just to give you a basic idea, genuine versus forgery. And so one of the other things that I've also found, you know, I don't know how many of you out there are, you know, betting people or people who sort of, you know, play the odds or take the odds and math into account when you think about how to look at things. But, you know, one of the things, if as many claims of Delarue printings of these stamps, you know, were valid as there are claims of them being Delarue printings, there would have to have been a heck of a lot more than what there really are. So the numbers game, if we look at it here, just to summarize, so the table that I've got here is just an excerpt from the Stevenson book, but it really tells the story. And basically the bottom line is, if you look at these, you know, just the figures that I'm quoting on the right here, is that essentially it's in the 80 to 90% range for each denomination. How many are, what percentage are printed by Perkins Bacon and what by Delarue? So in fact, the Delarue, you know, when you get to the sixpence and the 1 shilling examples, you know, basically it's 10 to 1, 10 to 1 difference between, you know, Perkins Bacon and Delarue. So in fact, the Delarue prints are way less common, and I think most sellers on you know, eBay and sites like that kind of failed to appreciate that and are constantly you know, thinking that they've got Delarue prints when they don't. So one of the ways to help us narrow it down, if we're looking at how we're going to identify our stamp, is by, you know, first of all, let's look at take a look at the paper. So if we've determined that we've got a genuine stamp versus a forged one, we've seen enough of those characteristics to know that it's genuine. That's the first good step. The way the catalogs are set up, they've especially Stanley Gibbons, which has chosen to assign major catalog numbers to examples on blued versus non-blued paper. And there's a whole story behind the bluing of the paper, and basically it was a consequence of the Perkins Bacon printing process, that they used some specific chemicals that were designed to make the ink of the stamp fugitive in case someone tried to tamper with it to chemically remove a postmark. And so, and a consequence of the chemical that they used to make the ink of the stamp fugitive turned the paper blue during the printing process. And the degree of bluing, according to Stevenson, varies by how damp or wet the paper was at the time of printing. And so if the paper was wetter, then the bluing would be a deeper shade, like the one here on the left. And if it was if it was only just a little damp, the bluing could be very faint, and sometimes, in fact, it can be really hard to see. So in the Gibbons catalog, they use the term use the terms deeply blued and slightly blued, and white for the non-blued paper. But what you need to understand about that is, there's no clear definition of what's deep versus what's slight. And the full, if you can imagine, if it's due to how wet the paper was, then the kind of the full spectrum of possible degrees of bluing is possible. So there's really, it's not a very good naming system, I think, to do it. In other parts of the Gibbons catalog, for example, like in the Great Britain part, they use the term paper more or less blued, and just put anything that's on blued paper in that category of more or less blued, which I think is the perfect way to do it. And so I'm trying to encourage Hugh Jeffreys to consider using that convention for the Cape Triangles as well in the Gibbons catalog. But just to take a look here, so it's not that easy always to identify the difference between the less blued, the slightly or less blued versus non-blued. And in fact, if you look at these examples here, the middle one and the one on the right, originally I thought that this one on the far right here, I thought that this one was the blued, was an example of the slightly blued paper, and that this one in the middle was the so-called white paper. And so I should also mention that the white paper is in fact only white in being that it's not blued, because you can get all sorts of brown tones or ink staining or all sorts of other things, and frankly it's in my experience not all that common to find Cape Triangles on genuinely really white paper. And it may just be a factor of how old they are and things like that, or application of the gum may have changed the paper as well, changed the color of the paper and things. Maybe it really was white, back in 1853 or whatever, but or not 1853, would have been after that. But in any case, maybe it really was originally white, but no longer. But anyway, another important point that I just want to make here is that from the Stevenson book, and it's very important to note, is that the only reliable way to tell bluing is by looking at the back of the stamp. That's the only way. You can't tell it from the front, and especially on stamps like this that are printed in blue as well, that further complicates the problem of being able to differentiate whether the stamp is printed on blued paper or not. And if we look at this one on the right, the paper in this case actually has blue speckling in it. And if you see that kind of speckling, that actually is transfer of ink that would have probably come about during the printing process or something like that. But there's a real difference, because the ones that are slightly blued and more deeply blued, these the bluing is a different color of blue than what the what the inks were that with which the stamps were printed. And so it's more of a, I see it as more of like a teal or a robin's egg blue, something like that is kind of the color that you want to look for. And it may not show up that well in the scan, but I can tell you that when I look at this stamp here, this is a stamp from my collection, the one in the middle. When I look at that stamp, I can see that pale teal color in it. And I have to give credit, it was noted Cape Triangle collector Richard Debney, who has exhibited and won major international awards in Cape Triangles. He was the one who helped me to first identify you know, these faintly or less blued examples, which I found really difficult at the beginning. But now that I've kind of, you know, picked up the knack a little bit and I know what to look for, now I'm able to do it. So, but this is an area for a lot of misidentification that you'll see in things that are being offered. Another important point is that I don't think gets taken into account that much. It's mentioned a little bit in Stevenson, is about changelings as well. So first of all, let's look at these two stamps. So the one on the left, this is a, you know, a Perkins-Bacon printing. This is a typical SG6 or 6A. So this is the blue or deep blue on, you know, the so-called white paper or non-blued paper. And the one on the right, this has the darker sort of navy or indigo blue color. This is typical of the Delarue printings. And so just looking at the color, the Perkins-Bacon one is a brighter blue. Some people have called it Prussian blue, but it's a brighter blue color for sure. And when you can, you know, have the stamps next to each other to look at them side by side, you can see the difference. And this one is this darker. So Stevenson uses the term indigo. Richard Debney has used the term navy to sort of try to describe that deeper, darker kind of blue that's characteristic of Delarue. But so that's the first main thing, is looking at the color. But on the subject of changelings, this is where you can really get into some trouble, and it's not. I don't think it's covered all that much in the in the older publications. Now, if you look at these two stamps, I don't know if you can tell, but they're the same stamp. Can't tell that by looking at the color, but in fact, you know, they are. And the one on the left, this is the stamp when I first got it. So this is an SG4, so it's a deep blue Perkins-Bacon printing on slightly blued paper, so just has faint bluing on the back. But when I first got it, it had these, you know, this color. If you look at the background there, it had this darker color and almost a slate kind of, or darker, you know, maybe some hints of that indigo in it. And so I originally thought that there was a chance that it might be a Delarue print. But then I started to look more closely, and I could see, if I look, like, for example, just along this edge here of the design above the 4 pence, I could see a little bit of brighter, you know, a brighter blue color. So, and then looking at the figure of Hope herself, some of her features seemed also maybe a little bit brighter and less of this kind of darkened color. So I was finally able to conclude that this stamp is sulfuretted. So this is a phenomenon that is incorrectly referred to as oxidation by a lot of people in our hobby, but it's actually brought on by reaction with sulfur in the air. And with these old inks that were used by Perkins-Bacon at the time, a reaction can take place that then discolors the stamp. And so there is a solution. If you use a little bit of hydrogen peroxide, it is possible, by giving the thing a brief soak in 3% hydrogen peroxide that you can buy in a pharmacy, you can restore the original color. And basically, so hydrogen peroxide is a chemical, but it's a bit unstable and wants to give up its one of its oxygen atoms quite readily. And so if you soak it, you can actually restore the original color. And so I have to also give some credit to my colleague from TSF, Jim Jackson, because Jim was one of the ones. So he's the Big Blue Stamp blog guy. He posted a lot of of stamps, a lot of 4-pence blues on TSF that he and I tried to identify together, and we started to see problems with the variation in the color, and so started to suspect sulfuretting. And so it was Jim who was the one who had the courage to go ahead and try to soak some of those and see if it could change the color, and it really could. So taking a look now, so here's another couple of stamps. So the one on the left here is from another one of my TSF colleagues, Jeff Swit, who kindly gave me permission to use his image in my presentation here. And so if we go back for a minute to the previous slide, unlike this one, in my example on the left there, the discoloration from the sulfuretting is pretty uniform. So it's hard to see the traces of the original color. And so that's why it would be easy to misidentify this stamp and think that it's potentially one of the later printings because of that dark color. But if you look at, for example, of Jeff's example here on the left, you can see that you definitely get this dark indigo look around the edges of the stamp, but the central part of the figure of hope and the engine turned background and all of that here is still that bright blue Perkins-Bacon color. So you can tell that the stamp has been discolored and it's sulfuretted. But if you look here on the right, this is a stamp from my collection. This is a Delarue print, an SG19, and you can see, the color is very similar between the sulfuretted dark blue on the Perkins-Bacon print here, and this indigo or navy-based type color that characterizes the Delarue prints there on the right. So it's a real trap, and a lot of sellers, particularly on eBay, offer sulfuretted copies of Perkins-Bacon prints as Delarue ones, and they don't know any better. So that happens a lot. So in addition to the color, one of the other areas that we need to look at is the print clarity. And so I said, early on that there's a lot of variability and a lot of variation in these stamps because of how long ago the printing was. And so this is a composite image that I put together with stamps from my own collection to show the difference. So Stevenson does talk about woolly prints in his book. And so these are what we have here. These are 3 SG18 varieties. So these are 1 penny Delarue prints that are the first 2 are the deep carmine red color, and the one on the right there is one of the red brown colors. It's probably an SG18C, I think, is the more likely. But the interesting part about these, more than the color, is the print clarity. And you can see that, like for example, the one here on the right is super sharp in its detail, and then the one in the middle is somewhere, kind of in between, starting to lose some of the detail in the background and in the webbing and stuff around the lettering. And then on the far left there, seriously woolly. And it's not, according to Stevenson, it's not due to plate wear, which is what a lot of people would assume, is that the plates were getting worn out by the time that Delarue had them. But he says that it has to do with the absorption of the ink into the paper, and that's what leads to these, more dominant woolly characteristics of the Delarue, the later prints. And so it's very, very interesting, I think, to look at these. And I should point out that in general, the catalog does not make any sort of distinctions between, various kinds of print clarity. So, for example, these 2 here, the one on the left and the one in the middle, would both be an SG18 deep carmine red. It's considered the same stamp. So talking a little bit more about print clarity, the other area is what Stevenson refers to as white patchiness. I prefer to call it light patchiness, but whatever way you want to talk about it, it basically means these lighter patches in the engine turned background of the stamp. And so this is the one on the left there is a stamp that I found listed on Hipstamp. And I borrowed the image there because it's about the most extreme example of this patchiness that I've seen. More typical is the stamp here on the right. This is one from my collection, and it's generally the patchiness is more subtle, but it's one of the clues that you can look for. This kind of patchiness is generally not evident in the Perkins-Bacon printings, in my experience. And so it's a nice indicator to be able to try to identify a De La Rue print. And again, another area too for print clarity is to look at is the level of detail in the figure of hope. But this, I believe, for example, so the one here on the right, this is a stamp from my collection. It's an SG3 brick red on slightly blue paper, and this is also an SG3 that belonged to another guy on our forum. And I was doing some comparison, and I noticed just a dramatic difference between the two. So I put this image together, and it may be that the one on the left could have been washed. It could have been chemically treated to remove the cancel. And that's one of the things that you have to be on the lookout for, is if you see the image of hope. I mean, it's one thing, looking back at this one, it's one thing to see a woolly print here like this, where the detail is somewhat lost, but the quality of the printing, it's still there, as opposed to this, where it looks like basically the detail has just been removed. So I think this is an example of a stamp that's probably been tampered with, but that, again, that's just my opinion. But it's something you have to watch for, because with the catalog values of these stamps where they are, it's the sort of, it's real tempting for unscrupulous sellers to try to improve the stamps by removing cancels and things like that. So another area, and if you do get a chance to look at the article that I wrote last year, this is probably the main part of it here. Comparison to reference examples is absolutely one of the key ways to do this. But unlike former times, like back in Stevenson's day, to be able to compare a stamp in your collection to a reference example, you were going to have to get your stamp to where that stamp was, and either you had to keep buying and assemble your own reference collection to be able to make your own comparisons, or you would have had to go to a dealer or some other place where somebody else had lots of examples that you could try to compare with. And it was difficult to be able to do such things. Well, nowadays, of course, with all of the digital images and stuff that we have available to us, we can really do a lot more than what we used to do. And so if we look here at these two stamps, this one on the left is a certified example that the image was shared with me by George James, who's the head of British Commonwealth at Stanley Gibbons' office in London. And he shared this with me as a reliably and correctly certified example of an SG19B, which is the very rare slate blue printing of from the De La Rue prints, which have some of these rare shades. And the one on the right, this is one that was posted by, this is an image that was posted by the guy that I told you about earlier in the presentation, that had made all these great posts on the forum and then left and deleted all his images. Well, this was one that I had the foresight to take a copy of before he left, and this was one that he told me was also an SG19B slate blue. Well, if you look at the two of these, just my opinion again, and I talk about this in lurid detail in my article, but I don't think there's any way that it could possibly be correct that the one on the right is also this rare shade. If the image supplied by SG is correct, then the one on the right doesn't look anything like it. So you know, and this is where I talk a little bit about challenging the status quo, because there seems to be this kind of, with these rare shades, there seems to be this kind of perception that stamps that exhibit this, you know, the patchiness, this light patchiness in the background and stuff like that, that means that they're a rare shade. I don't particularly agree with that, and I think that the SG examples bear it out. And I would say that I would also just comment that you know, where these shades came from as catalog listings in the first place was from SG. So why wouldn't we go to SG to, you know, wouldn't their opinion count more than anybody else's? Well, I think so. And it kind of surprises me that even in like the Stevenson book, he basically says, well, there seems to be, you know, a great, you know, many different opinions about, you know, what these different shades mean and all of that, and you know, no one can seem to agree. And he mentions the part about the, you know, about the greenish tint and stuff like that, which which seems to be what you know, a lot of people attribute to these rare shades. But you know, he says it, but he doesn't say that that's the case, or that he believes that or anything like that. But he says that seems to be what others are deciding or doing for themselves. And so in the end, it seems to have, I won't say, you know, a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it seems to have become that that's the norm more than anything else, is that many sellers and certifiers are certifying examples like this one here on the right and claiming that that's a slate blue, and I don't really think that it could be. If it's really the rare shade, and this is, you know, this is one of those rarities there on the left, then other examples should look like that. There shouldn't be multiple possibilities for a rare shade, at least not the way I would see it. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be rare. So this is another example here. So on the left, again, is the same Stanley Gibbons BPA certified example. On the right is a stamp that I bought when I was living in the UK a couple of years ago that was sold to me as a slate blue, but I also don't think that it is. It's a nice woolly print and shows the indigo color and all that. It's definitely a Delarue print, but the price was right, so I bought it anyway, even though I didn't believe it was really a slate blue. This is also shown in my article. But this one, so again, same stamp on the left. On the right, this one, I think, has a chance of maybe actually being a slate blue. And this is one from my collection that I've got, and I think that the color looks promising, but you know, I'm going to have to get it expertized by some, you know, a firm that's really got the experience to be able to do it right. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along here. So just want to also just talk a teeny bit about, I see I'm bumping up against my time limit here, so I still have a couple more slides. I'll try to do these fairly quickly. You know about how, so talking a little bit about the current market, you know about how when people talk about real estate, they say, what are the 3 most important factors in real estate? Location, location, location. Well, I think that when it comes to buying, you know, buying Cape Triangles, the number one thing is that the 3 most important factors are condition, condition, condition. And I can't emphasize that enough. There is just a lot of really poor quality material that's out in the market now, stamps without good margins, stamps with thins and tears and other damage, or super heavy cancels that are so obliterating that you can't even see the image of hope very well, and stuff like that. There's a lot of or repaired or whatever. So so always try to go for the best condition that you can get, and bear in mind that there's going to be always some risk associated with the various price levels. And if you buy from major auction houses or more established dealers and things like that, you're going to pay more, but generally speaking, you're going to get higher quality product, and you're going to get stamps that have a better chance of being correctly identified, although not always. But if you are interested in taking a flyer on eBay and hip stamp and stuff like that, get to know the sellers. You'll start to clue in after a while. If you study these things, who knows what they're selling and what they're not. Some of the downside of the online buying is that image quality is highly variable and sometimes really not very good. That can cut both ways, though. Sometimes if you think you can spot something that's really good, but it's just a poor image, and that puts off other buyers, then maybe you can get a bargain that way. But it could also go the opposite way, and that you think you're getting one thing and you get the stamp and it's not what the image looked like. Something else that just drives me crazy, that's one of my pet peeves, is that that most of the online sellers do not show images of the back. And if you're going to establish bluing or figure out, look for the watermark to see whether it's there, and to see if it's an upright one or a sideways watermark or something like that. Any Cape Triangle that you buy, you should really, if you're buying it online, you should get good images of both the front and the back. Very important. Print clarity also, again, can be an important factor. And look for the details, because if it's a decent scan that's on there, you should be able to tell if it's been tampered with or repaired or something. And just a comment about expertising is that, in my interview with George James, and I mentioned this in my article, he told me that, BPA there in the UK is the gold standard for Cape Triangles. And I cannot tell you how many supposedly certified examples of Cape Triangles I've seen that, just in my opinion, it just doesn't seem like what they're being certified as could possibly be right. And I think that this is because that a lot of dealers who have good general experience in 19th century stamps are certifying Cape Triangles as rare shades and things like that, but without really the experience base that they need. And just as an example, I don't want to beat up the APS or anything. I'm a proud lifetime member, but as I was looking through their certs online, believe it or not, this example here on the far right, upper right there, that has an APS certificate as a genuine Cape Triangle. And I just think there's no way it could possibly be. It looks like a spiral forgery to me, and I could not believe that it was actually being offered for sale in the APS stamp store at one point. And I checked the cert online, and it's there. Somebody certified this as a genuine example. So anyway, so if you're going for expertising, be sure you get somebody who knows what they're talking about. And so just to kind of wrap things up, so just in case you think that, Cape Triangles can only be a collecting interest for people with tons and tons of money, that's not necessarily true. And other things that you can do, and I've dabbled in some of these things just a little bit myself too, is you can do topical collecting of stamps on stamps, because Cape Triangles are so famous and iconic. There have been stamps, so plenty of stamps that emulate the Cape Triangles or have examples of Cape Triangles on them. This includes Cinderellas as well as as well as rectangular issues, as you see there. I've also played around with do-it-yourself Cape Triangle Cinderellas, and so in the center there, this is a Cape Triangle Christmas stamp that I created myself. And so I took bits and pieces using PowerPoint actually to manipulate the image, but I took bits and pieces from other stamps and put that multicolored Christmas label together. And my wife actually liked it so much that she let me put them like Christmas seals on the backs of our Christmas cards last year. So and I also have just done some other messing around with printing sort of Cape Triangle Cinderellas. So here's one and it's from a plate proof or die proof sort of thing. So it's a color trial sort of thing. So it's a red 1 shilling, which wasn't one of the regular postage stamps, but I just print up some of those and use them on philatelic correspondence. And when I take them to the post office for hand canceling, when I was living in Oxford, for example, the clerks there at the post office were willing to hit them with a cancel for me. So I thought that was just kind of fun. And so just to show you then at the bottom here, this stamp on the very far left, that's a genuine Cape Triangle from my collection. This one to the right is a Cinderella that I created. So I made the Cinderellas a larger size so that they couldn't possibly be mistaken for real Cape Triangles by anybody. And so this is a black one. So obviously it's also not one of the, colors from the postage stamps. And so then there's a modern triangle there just to kind of show that the larger size. It's just 4 or 5 millimeters bigger. And one of the other things that Rob knows about that we did on TSF was we did a triangle birthday celebration. So on the 1st of September, which is when the first Cape Triangles were released, I call that the triangle birthday. And so every 1st of September on TSF, we do some kind of a little birthday thing for triangles, and everybody posts images of triangles from their collection. So I'm still interested in doing more work on this, and there's a quote there from Stevenson where he mentions that these, the shades of the 4-pence Delarue stamps are one of the unexplored areas, and I don't think they've been explored that much since the days of Stevenson. So I'm happy to start, trying to do more of that. That was the focus of my article, but there's still more to be done. And so he mentions, a truly scientific basis for differentiating the shades. And so I'm going to try to do some things with, images from the auction catalog, the Maxwell Joseph one that I mentioned earlier, as well as the SG color key. And you can see some images here from that show you what the slate blue is supposed to look like. And this does, in fact, match the certified example that they gave me. So I didn't have that resource at the time I wrote the article, but I've got it now. And also there's possibly some non-philatelic resources that could be brought into play that can be used to, quantify colors by formulas and stuff like that. I also have been doing some work on a soaking study, contrasting effects on the stamp of soaking in water versus hydrogen peroxide. And I also, am interested in trying to, look into the potential for, getting some revisions to the catalog done, maybe to, address the blued paper issue and maybe to include print clarities and things. So that's it. That's the end.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful presentation. We have some questions here that have come into the queue. Chris,
Before we get to Bruce, I have a public service announcement. As I bring you over, please accept coming over and do turn on your video so that way we could see you. And now back to the show, back to Bruce.
Great, Chris, thank you very much. This very interesting presentation. I don't really know very much about the Cape Triangles, but here's sort of my question / observation. It seems to me that when you're comparing colors, and you spent some time showing the comparison of the Stanley Gibbons certified I forget even which blue variety it was, against another candidate, it seems to me that the most valid comparison is going in a scanned situation is going to be where the two stamps are set on the scanner side by side. So you don't get issues around lighting, scanner, this, that, and the other thing, where, or temperature, or whatever might be affecting the scan in London and the scan in Miami. Even if they're taken on the same day, the different scanners could create different results.
Absolutely.
No doubt. I completely agree with that. It's one of the, and you know, it's funny because I always used to think that people on the stamp forum who used to get into arguments with each other about colors and stuff like that and color shades and stuff, I always thought this is the most ridiculous thing of all time because you know, there's so many different factors that affect it, and there's no doubt that, you know, being able to scan the two stamps together under the exact same conditions and stuff like that, that's the only absolutely, you know, surefire way to do it. But you know, that it's just not possible. You know, in fact, I don't have access to that stamp. Even SG doesn't have access to that stamp anymore because it's already been sold. So
Right.
all that we have access to anymore is the image that they scanned of it before they sold it. So
this is
you know,
it's just going to present a challenge. I think when you're
it is
dealing
going to present
with color.
it is going to present a challenge. So, but you know, I think though that, you know, I always told myself I wasn't going to go down this slippery slope of color shades, but I think when it comes to these few things, I'm going to try to dedicate some effort to figuring out how to do this. And you know, I think I've got a chance if I can get a certified example, and then I can try to do some quantification using software and compare it then to other stamps.
Yeah.
And do it that way. So I just, you know, I'm going to have to do the best I can with the materials that I can get.
So the one other idea that just sort of jumped in my mind as we've been thinking about this just now would be, I understand the Gibbons example that you showed is sold in a collection somewhere, but you also had the Gibbons example, the Gibbons color book, and you showed the scan of the 4 examples of blue. And presumably the color book is more available to be scanned with a stamp against the color book examples in the same scan on the same clad and same temperature, same day, et cetera, et cetera.
That's
that might be one.
I hope so.
To try it out.
Yep, I hope so. I need to get one of those. At this point, I only just have the images, scanned images from somebody else's color book. I don't own one of those because those are also not cheap anymore. But still, in the big scheme of things, should be obtainable. So it's on my wish list.
Yeah. Well, you'd like to think that the expertization people, you know, perhaps I think of the APS and the APRL. I think, does their reference collection include the Stanley Gibbons Color Guide in Bellefonte? I'd like to think, well, yes, of course, but who knows? And then at least we would have a place that we could go and take our patients, if you will, and put them on a scanner against some relatively known standard. Just something to think about.
Absolutely, I agree.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I really appreciate your talk.
Thank you.
As far as the APS is concerned, that book is in the APRL, the library.
Okay. If I'm ever in Pennsylvania, I'll have a look.
Bob Vogel,
Yeah, I've got
nice
a
to
couple.
see you. I hope
Yeah,
there's not a lot of snow.
We've got way too much snow still, but it's going quickly. Thanks, Joe. Nice to see you as well. Chris, that was a fantastic presentation. So far from what I collect, but I just found it terribly interesting. I got a couple of quick questions for you, nothing too serious. what is the beryllium guy?
Well, so that's my
That's
my
not a quick
handle.
question.
Yeah, well, that's my handle on the stamp forum, but basically, but I use it also professionally because I spent my career in the beryllium industry. So so that's where I've virtually all the Cape Triangles that I own have been funded by my working in beryllium. So I'm a materials engineer by education and experience, and so I have in-depth experience with with beryllium metal, which is not a very common area to have experience in, but it's also not one that a lot of people care about, to be honest.
Thank you for that. I'm always curious about people's monikers. That's quite intriguing. Another question, the Alan Stevenson that wrote the one book, reference book you referred to, was he
Yes.
any relation to the Stevenson that designed the lighthouses?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, the family. Yeah,
Okay.
the whole family designed lighthouses.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, he wrote a book. He wrote a book about lighthouses too.
Yeah,
Okay. Interesting.
The father of Robert Louis Stevenson, the author, he was a lighthouse engineer, and his brother was a lighthouse engineer, and his father was a lighthouse engineer. Between them, they designed about something like 30 lighthouses around the UK.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, I had the opportunity to visit some of them. Fantastic. I don't want to take up too much time here, but that sack of stamps that the sailor brought, with your illustration there, looked like there might have been thousands. How come they're so scarce?
Well, if you looked at the printing the printing figures from the Stevenson book that I showed in the presentation, also, I mean, millions were printed actually.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But they're scarce because they're really old and they're highly in demand. Lots of collectors want them, and a lot of them didn't survive because it's been such a long time.
Okay. Okay. And the last comment I want to make, with your Prussian blue, I don't know if Richard Judge is on this forum tonight, or if you even know Richard Judge from someplace in the Midwest. He's done an extensive study on the Prussian blue with analytical forensic type philately, and he'd be a good guy to get a hold of if you really want to check out your Prussian blue stuff.
Okay.
I can.
Yeah, I know
can,
some. I mean, bear in mind that SG does not call it Prussian blue, the
Okay.
Cape Triangles. Richard Debney sometimes refers to it that way. But what I thought was interesting was that when I finally looked at the Prussian blue example in the SG color key, it doesn't actually look that much to me like the color that I see in the Perkins-Bacon prints of the Cape Triangle. So I don't know if it's legitimate to call it Prussian blue or not.
Nope.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, I see Richard here, so he can comment more on that than I can. Thanks, Richard. Thanks again, Chris.
Do you want the comments now, or should I wait later on?
Oh, Richard, if we're on the topic, I think you should go.
Okay. I'd be very glad to have a look at it. The way you could look at it is either through two instruments. One is the X-ray fluorescence, and the other one is a Fourier transform infrared, which would probably give you a definitive answer on the Prussian blue if it's there or not. So what I'm offering is that if you want to send me some pretty beat up stamps, go through the mail, presumably I could have a quick look at some of them and tell you whether the ink chemistry is in fact definitive. So I'd be willing to do that for you.
Well, thank you. So is it for from a technical point of view, for the composition to be right for Prussian blue, is it related to it has to contain this prussiate of potash or something like that? Is Is that linked together or not necessarily?
That is true. Regrettably, as you mentioned out, the catalog's called Prussian blue as a shade, but Prussian blue is actually a chemical, it's a potassium ferrocyanide. So the true Prussian blue has got this sort of greenish tint to the blue, but it's very, as I say, it's very definitive. If it's there, it can be spotted very readily.
Okay.
And this is
Okay.
the
Well,
first
I
time-
hope to get in touch with you then, because I'd love to send you. I've got some spares that I could send off for testing.
I guess best thing is I'll give Joan my email address and we can get through contact with her.
Okay.
Terrific.
Good.
Okay,
Thank you.
Frank Bloom, you have a question. Welcome. Nice to see you.
More of a comment than a question. And when you're doing shades, I have found, being here in Florida, that you have to have natural light and a lot of, and pretty consistent light to see the shades. And the shades are not necessarily the same on different stamps. They're based off of the main color of the stamp. So if the main color is a medium blue and this one's a darker blue, that's the darker blue shade, whatever they want to call it, and so forth. So that's how I've been able to do it with US stamps, especially because that's what I've been trying to work on specifically, to be able to see those shades. I'm in my room, my stamp room, by the way, and I got a huge picture window, but faces north. So I'm not getting sun directly in, I'm getting it indirectly, but I'm able to use it, that light, that consistent light source. That's the only thing I've been able to do and actually see the shades, because sometimes I'll take them to our meeting location, which is an indoor building with all fluorescent lights, and the shades are totally different.
Yeah, no, I know lighting makes a huge difference. And yeah, it's one of the real challenges. There's no doubt about it.
Richard Judge was the first to mention X-ray fluorescence, and I'm surprised nobody's talked about it up to now, because that gives you the ink composition and certainly separates the various inks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good
Frederick-
it's a good idea if you've got access to equipment like that, for sure.
Richard's got it.
Yep. And by the way, just in case anybody was wondering, a little cocktail party knowledge. Every XRF tube has a beryllium window in it, a beryllium transmission window. And so being the beryllium guy, I know about this because I also worked in the beryllium X-ray window business for a significant chunk of my 30-year career. So
When were you at Tech? I'm also a Tech graduate.
I was there in the late 70s and early 80s. I graduated in 81.
I'm 64.
Frederick Lawrence, do you have your hand up?
Yes. Hi, Chris. Frederick Lawrence here. Continuing with the Prussian blue just for a moment, while you're waiting for your stamps to be analyzed, you showed on one of your slides the front cover of the dust jacket of the Maxwell Joseph auction. If you will turn that dust jacket over, the bottom illustration is a Mafeking siege cover with a vertical pair of the 3-pence large format Baden-Powell head stamps. It's actually the largest multiple known on cover of that particular stamp. All of the blueprint stamps were produced with the ferro-prussiate process, and they are Prussian blue. So just take any candidate, lay it down next to the printed image here on the back of the dust jacket, and you'll get a pretty good comparison. Now, this is a printed example, but it's very close to the actual color of the Mafeking siege ferroprussiate stamps.
Okay. Thank you for that tip.
Joseph, you have your hand up.
Oh, well, I was going to make a comment about the X-ray fluorescence, and I broke in, so I'll take my hand down. But please check the chat, because not the chat, the Q&A, because I have an appeal there. If anybody saw my mother's collection, I'd like to know about it. She had some Cape Triangles. Her collection was mostly Indian. It was created in India in the 1920s.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little more for everybody?
Well, she was in her old age. She was in Grants Pass, Oregon. I noticed we have somebody here that's in Eugene, and somebody spirited her collection out of the house while she was, receiving care, daily care until she died. And when we went out there to settle the estate, all kinds of stamp collecting stuff was there, but not her core collection. The core collection was gone.
Oh.
It's a shame. And you reported that to the APS, I take it.
No, I didn't report it to the APS. Everything is too vague. But if somebody, if some collector has seen an old time collection heavy in India that had 3 or 4 Cape Triangles in it, that is possibly hers, especially if it happened up in Oregon.
Okay. Well, I encourage you to report it to the APS if you have photos, because they do the red alert to all the houses for us to be on watch for it.
Well, we don't have any photos. The last time I saw those Cape Triangles was when I was a kid, about 10 years old.
That's a shame. Good luck with that. Richard Moss, you have a question?
Yes, good evening. Now, I'm going back 40 years here when our local society had a visit from Ron R.A.G. Lee, who was at the time one of the great experts on the Cape Triangles. And one thing which he emphasized to us, and he kept on emphasizing it, was the need to keep these, to make certain that these stamps didn't get in very heavy light because they deteriorated very quickly. Has anybody got any comments on that in terms of what the advice is 40 years on?
Well, I think that's still good advice,
Yeah.
especially the sixpence ones, which are lilac. The Perkins Bacon are shades of lilac, and the Delarue is a considered mauve, but and it's darker. But nonetheless, those lilac shades are especially susceptible to fading due to exposure to light. So, I mean, coupled with the fact that one of the color shades is pale lilac, and so pale lilac in the first place, and coupled with the propensity to to be affected by fading due to exposure to sunlight, not a good combination. Also makes it hard to identify those stamps correctly, I think, as well. Just my opinion, because there's also a deep lilac, but I sometimes wonder, how can you tell whether you've got a deep lilac example that's just been faded to look pale, or if it's the genuine pale lilac? So I don't know, maybe somebody who has more expertise in that than I do can differentiate those two, but I can't particularly tell the difference, I don't think.
Thank you.
Richard.
Yes, I have a short story which Chris might be interested in, based on beryllium. Back in 1980s, when I was at the Ministry of the Environment, we had just bought a new X-ray spectrometer. And while the technician was putting in the detector and the X-ray tube, he inadvertently just touched the beryllium window and it shattered, based on its very, very fragile nature. Agreed?
It can be, yeah.
Because it's ultra thin.
Yes, for analytical source tubes and detectors, the beryllium foil is really thin, can be just a matter of microns.
Yeah.
So yes, for medical, it's different. So mammography and CT scanning and all of that also use beryllium windows, but they're a lot thicker. And not subject to breakage that same way. But yes, the analytical X-ray equipment with beryllium windows, the beryllium is really thin. Yeah.
So Richard, how do you get access to all these good toys?
Regrettably, you got to buy them. I guess it's a midlife crisis. Most people go out and buy a Corvette. I bought an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer.
Okay. On that note, Patrick.
Okay, the first I just want to comment that I started collecting when I was very young, and one of the elusive things that I always wanted to get was a Cape Triangle. And it wasn't until later in my collecting life that I actually got some, but I was very happy to do so. But I wanted to comment on something that Chris touched on during his presentation about hydrogen peroxide. Soaking stamps in hydrogen peroxide isn't really a good idea because it could cause chemical changes depending on any other kind of, if there's any contaminants in the stamp itself or anything like that. The best way to do it is to use fumes from hydrogen peroxide. Or actually, I think acetone also can do it. But what you do is either take a Q-tip, dip it in the hydrogen peroxide so that it's not dripping, and then pass it over the stamp, just over the surface of the stamp so that it doesn't touch the stamp, but the fumes get into the ink. Or you can take a bowl, put some hydrogen peroxide in it, cover it with some plastic screening, and place the stamp on top of, face down on top of the screening, and let it sit for a little bit so that, and move the stamp around a little bit, and so that the fumes will affect the ink, but not actually get into the stamp itself.
Good to know. Evan, I caught you mid fumbling there.
Thank you. No, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself and to lower my hand now. First of all, Chris, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I too am a Cape of Good Hope collector, and I found your talk really very, very interesting. I've also gone on the website you're monitoring, and I've read the threads as well there. My question has to do with cancellations, because I have a number of stamps that don't have the traditional CGH triangle cancellation with the bars, but instead have either handwriting, which I think would be fiscal, some circular with a number in it. And I'm wondering if A, that's evidence of forgeries, or B, just fiscal use, or C, something else. And would those, of course, non-traditional cancels devalue the stamp, or would they make them more interesting to collect? And I'll just mute myself and listen. Thank you.
Sure. Well, really good question there. What I would say is that probably you'd have to take them on a case-by-case basis, but probably the the ones with the handwritten type cancels on, these are probably fiscal ones. And there are, if you have access to the Stevenson book, or if you look in the thread on the stamp forum, we recently had a discussion about fiscal cancels on Cape triangles. And so in addition to, script ones, you can also find that there are round dated cancels, or the letters of paid, PAID, well spaced out, so you can only get maximum of, if you're lucky, 2 letters on one stamp, for example, and things like that. And they're the only actual circular dated cancels that I've seen on Cape triangles are actually a fiscal cancel as well. So and supposedly, I mean, the general rule is that fiscal cancels are less valuable than postally canceled stamps. And so, but I would say that in the market these days, kind of a really nice fiscal cancel, like one that's got a legible date on it and stuff like that, sellers are asking big money for those, way over and above, I think, what a normal postally canceled one would go for. So so I think it just depends. It depends on the quality of the cancel and stuff like that. But I mean, as a general rule, my understanding is that fiscal cancels are not as considered to be not as good as a postal cancel. But in some cases, like the least common stamps in terms of the numbers game there is pretty much the 6p and the 1 shilling Delarues, and getting those with nice with nice postal cancels on them, really difficult to find them, really difficult. It's easier to find them unused than it is with a really good postal cancel on them. So, and in one of my 6p Delarues has got a script cancel on it, and but it's a nice stamp, but I got it super cheap because it was just a fiscal cancel and most people didn't want it.
If you're interested, I can send you some scans and you can take a look at some of them.
Yeah, I would be very interested. Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
You mentioned that stamp form. Do you want to put the link to it in the chat? We'll also send it around.
I can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that way we get the right. Mike White, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Are you all well? This presentation is a million mile away from my boring postal history. However, I have found it interesting, and I've also found it interesting regarding the various conversations about the triangular stamps. To me, and correct me if you wish, anybody, blue is blue, red is red, green is green. The various shades are really down to a person's personal perception. Be it that Gibbons produced this color coding book, is it truly accurate? I don't know. I have no idea. There are so many factors that can affect it. And really moving on to the question of forgeries, then I don't know how many there are, what percentage of the prints there are, and again, to determine whether a stamp is genuine or indeed a forgery has a lot to do with the eyes and intuition experience and knowledge of the appraiser. So it's, to me, it can be an absolute nightmare. I would hate to find a triangular used on a military entire, because, to be frank, I'd be clueless as to, one, whether it belongs, two, whether it's genuine, three, what colour is it, four, who the printers were. I'd have simply no idea. And in the world that we live in today, oxidization plays a big factor in anything you look at. So I don't know. They're just my observations of a rather interesting and well presented presentation on these somewhat elusive and rare stamps. I don't know what anybody else thinks, but there you've got my thoughts. But thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mike. Yeah, it's colors have always been interesting. I'll go with can't go by my own spectrometer like some other people on this forum. Anyway, Patrick, you've had your hand up and you're patient.
Well, first I want to comment on Mike's comments about color. You have to remember back at the time that these stamps were produced, and this is for every country, you didn't go out and buy barrels of ink that was standardized. Every time they went to do a print run, they actually had to create the ink by grinding up the pigment and mixing it with the oils and solvents and everything else. So from one batch to the next, the color could be slightly different, which is why there are shades. You know, even when you agree that it's one particular shade, or like you take one particular shade, you could find stamps with varying hues of that shade, whereas, you know, based on the chemical, the minor characteristics of the chemical composition. So that's why you have that problem in the first place. They didn't start out to create different colors. It's just that one, you know, depending on who was mixing the ink, or even the weather conditions on that day or something else, that's how you ended up with all these different shades in the stamps. That's same with Britain, Cape of Good Hope, United States, Canada, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the thing that I wanted to ask Chris about, one of the characteristics of Cape Triangles he didn't touch on has to do with the watermarks. Specifically, how the sideways watermarks. And since the stamps were not, or, you know, they were printed diagonally on the sheet, how do you tell which way is sideways?
I can answer that. Yeah, I didn't talk about the watermarks, you're right, but yeah, I mean, it's not what you would think, because it's not the way it's supposed to be is an upright anchor roughly in the middle of the triangle. And if you end up with the so-called sideways watermark, it doesn't mean that it's just a sideways watermark in the middle of the triangle, sideways anchor in the middle of the triangle. What you end up getting is actually down on the bottom, along the bottom, you get two halves of anchors that are you get, yeah, so that are sideways, that are rotated 90 degrees from, you know, the normal orientation of the watermark. So that's what the sideways ones look like. And it's not always that easy to spot them as well. It's one of those things that, and you rarely ever see them advertised as such on you know, on auction sites like eBay and stuff like that. They rarely ever come up correctly identified. The only two that I have in my collection were ones that I bought from sellers who didn't know what they had. I could tell from the scans that were on the, you know, posted, but they weren't identified as sideways watermark because most people don't know how to spot it. It's Stevenson gives a good explanation in his book and shows the layout of what the watermarks are supposed to look like and all that. And there's a really good article that was written by another member of the Cape and Natal study circle that was republished. It was originally published like 10 years ago, and it was republished in the last edition of the Cape and Natal Philatelic Journal. So if you take a look for that, it's a fantastic article. And he really does some in-depth analysis about the whole thing and how it's possible for slight shifting of the paper to have resulted in some stamps having no watermark at all, which is really very interesting. But anyhow, that's another subject.
Interesting. Joseph, are you in the United States?
Yes, I'm
Okay, I'm going to jump to you, who I know who's way up past his bedtime, if you don't mind, because I know he's getting tired. You, Jeffries. I'm going to give deference to the people who are up past midnight. You have to unmute. He didn't expect that.
Thank you. No, I didn't. Sorry about that. Yeah, just to add to the Stanley Gibbons story, this came about, he was in the 1890s, the Stanley Gibbons Journal, and this is where he told the story first. And to say that he was a man prone to a bit of exaggeration is being very charitable. The amount of truth you can place on it is up to you. But what we do know, we do have copies of correspondence where he was offering triangles by the gross, by the 500 after the purchase. So he certainly had huge quantities of them. When I first joined Stanley Gibbons in 1975, I was invited to meet the chairman for the welcome to the company. And I was amazed, he had a pile of Cape triangulars on his desk. There must have been many. I could sort Perkins Bacon's from De La Rue's. My suspicion was that he was piling them up into reds and blues, but you know, who knows. So that's a bit of the Stanley Gibbons story being mentioned as the color key. The color key was devised, the present version of the color key was devised in 1970, and it was based on the colors that were appearing in the catalogue up until that time. Now, ever since then, every new stamp that's been described for the catalogue has been ascribed its colour by that colour key. But they made the point at the time it was introduced that they weren't going to go back and change all the colours of the earlier stamps that had already been listed. And of course, anybody knows that, say, a Prussian blue on a Cape of Good Hope stamp would not look the same as a Prussian blue on a South Australia or a Ceylon, or, well, I mean, compare the Prussian blue Silver Jubilee, Great Britain, with the Prussian blue Cape of Good Hope, totally different colors. So the color key can't be accurate for both of them. And which one it is accurate for, I don't know. I wouldn't try to assign an exact color using the color key, but it is the closest guide that you'll get. So, you know, it is worth getting hold of one and putting it beside your stamps to check what you've got. Okay.
Thank you for that. Joseph, thank you for being so patient. And now it's
Can I go to bed
back
now?
to you. You could go to.
I was just going to comment. I'm a physicist by training, and actually I've done some work with beryllium, Chris, brazing work back in the 70s. It's kind of tricky trying to braze beryllium. Anyway, the problem, as far as I'm concerned, is that color is an illusion. It's a combination of the light that's shining on the thing and the chemicals that are in there and the sensitivity of your particular eye. So it seems to me, I mean, you can use X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to figure out what the atomic, the atoms in there are, but it seems to me some sort of optical spectroscopy would be a better way to see what the colors are. And I don't know if anyone has done, Chris, has anyone done optical spectroscopy on these things? And you'd have to be very careful about it. You'd have to actually have a quote unquote white piece of reflector and then the stamp next to it and get optical spectroscopy from both and then subtract the white data from the stamp data to get an accurate measurement of what the color actually, the range, the spectrum of the colors are. That's a tricky business. Do you know if anyone's done
it? I do not know.
Yeah.
Someone else knows. Maybe Richard Judge might know.
I mean, even you know, people are talking about passing scans back and forth. Scanners are going to change the color. What you see on the screen, you can change the color of the screen to make it almost anything you want it to be.
Yep.
So the whole color business is really very, very tricky.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that.
Any comments to Joseph?
Can I just?
I knew you were chomping at the bit, Richard. Go on.
What you're referring to, there's reflectance spectroscopy. And although it looks like it could be quantitative and to give you what is called CIE numbers, lab numbers, my own experience there is because you're dealing with engraved stamps, that the background paper, through aging or through just natural variations in the color of the paper, really does modify the reflectance spectrum. And so it becomes very difficult to just match what appears to your eye to be identical shades. On the reflectance spectra, they look very different, or vice versa. You have almost a good match, and yet by your eye, it looks like it's a very different shade. So my own experience with reflectance is it's not that reliable. I much prefer using X-ray fluorescence, and rather than say it is a specific color or shade, I like to say it's got a particular formulation of the elements present. And therefore, you're able to group various printings by their elemental distributions, different combinations. And I'm just starting now a study on the small Queens 3 cent in Canada. And that was produced from about 1870 on. And the variation in the inks, as mentioned by somebody else, is enormous. But I'm hoping to find some sort of pattern in the grouping of these elements that can say it came from a particular time period. That's the hope anyway.
Now you confused me because you was next to you, Jeffries, and I thought you had two U's going on, but welcome you.
Yes, I just wanted to thank Chris in particular. I belong to the Stamp Forum, and I'd never really belonged to anything up to about a year and a half ago. But the color situation I can identify very well with, because I was in the paint and wallpaper business for quite a few years, and then I went to work for Benjamin Moore and Company in Toronto in 1990, my first midlife crisis. And I was amazed when I got there. They were still color matching by eye. The guys on the floor in the factory doing 800-gallon batches of reds and greens and stuff, they were still doing it by eye. We had the color spectrometers, but it was still, push came to shove, it was an eye. And the whole thing about color being a judgment thing, that comes down to it. And running a small retail paint and wallpaper store, it was quite challenging sometimes to get people to realize that the red you see on a color sample is not what it's going to look like on your wall because of the lighting and it's involved and stuff. I had a sign in my store window that said, if we can't match the color you want, it's a pigment of your imagination. So that's my only comments. I just wanted to thank Chris very much for leading me on to this forum. It's the first time I've sat in one of these talks on stamps.
Good to see you, Hugh. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, I think it's a great way to really discuss things in real time, but not that the forum's sort of real time. But Clive, you have your hand up here. Welcome.
Oh, unmute. Hi. I just wanted to mention the scanner factor. There was a software product, I forget what it was called, and I think I first read about it on the Stamp Forum, whereby you actually took your color key and you scanned it, and the software product stored a table from your color key so that when you stamp stamps in the future, it would actually match them to the scanned color key. So thereby taking out the hardware factor, the difference in the different hardware pieces of hardware. So you were matching whatever was scanned on the color key with the stamp you were scanning. So I thought it was a useful idea. I never tried it. And unfortunately, I forget what the product was called. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah,
That's
I'm blanking out on the name of it too, but I'm going to, my plan is to download that software. I know where I can find the information on the forum, and my plan is to download that software and try to use it to help with the identification. But you're right, you have to be able to load a color key into it.
Well, would that hold water?
Sorry?
Doing it that way. Would that really work?
I don't know. I haven't tried it yet.
Okay. To be determined. Alex.
Hi. Just to say hi to Chris and hope I'll see him in New York in July next year. He's coming across back over the water again. We've met many, many times on TSF. And to say hi to all those guys on TSF that I've met here. I'm heading off now because it's what goodness knows, 1:30 in the morning. No, 1 o'clock in the morning. Time for Betty Buys. So ciao, everybody.
Ciao.
Good night, Alex.
Good seeing you, Alex.
Good seeing you.
We're going to have to give these guys in Europe preferential treatment when they raise their hand. We'll have to have English. And Duncan, welcome. I like the look.
Yes, the one comment from Garfield Porch when he was talking about, I think it was the RPS stamp panel or the stamp talk. There may be seasonal variation in some of the Canadian stamps because they were burning coal and the sulfur from the sulfur dioxide gets into the ink. So summer stamps are less likely to be sulfurated than winter stamps.
Interesting.
My involvement with beryllium was beryllium donuts for a slowpoke reactor. You change the reflection as fuel depletes, increase the reflection, you can still keep criticality with a less reactive core.
That's right.
And
beryllium
beryllium
is the
brazing
most
of can-do fuel bundles.
Yeah, yes. Well, the beryllium is one of the only metals that will wet zirconium, which is what the fuel bundles are made out of, zircaloy. So yes, absolutely. And beryllium is the most efficient neutron donor of any element in the periodic table. So that's why it's of interest in fusion research, which is the area that I'm working in now.
And I can't comment on my father's interest because he wasn't working on civil projects.
Are we all talked out?
Well, Chris, I've seen a couple comments here that your presentation was too short and that we need a part 2.
Yeah. And I also have Keith here who's chomping at the bit to say something. So I'm just gonna let him take a seat here because why don't you? Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Keith.
Hello.
Through the years, I've handled a few Cape of Good Hope stamps, and I'd like to show you guys, because we're all getting on forgeries and experts and the like. I'd like to show you this cover here.
That's good enough. They get the gist. It's good
Okay,
enough to do.
okay. It's a wood block. All right. And it's only a front. Comes with 2 certificates. The BPA says it's a genuine stamp, but may not belong on the cover. And the Royal Philatelic Society of South Africa says the stamp is a fake and obviously, therefore, doesn't belong on the cover. So even those 2 big boys of expertising couldn't tell whether or not it was a genuine wood block. And that is very telling. Now, you want my opinion on the front? My opinion on the front is they're both wrong. I think it's genuine stamp used on a front because who would waste a wood block putting it on a front rather than putting it on a cover? So I don't think they take common sense on occasions into the equation of their expertising. One little last thing, which is great to think about. This is another one. And I'll get this up there yet. You can see it. It's a bisect and a single. This one they said was bad. Disagree with them again. That's all I can say. It's not so easy out there. I really, in my experience, have not seen a good faked triangle. Not a good one. Most of them you could are pretty obvious about it. And I don't know what the APS was thinking at the time. And one last thing I'd like to straighten out. Maxwell Joseph's collection was the biggest collection of Cape of Good Hope ever formed. But Louise Boydell and Alfred Lichtenstein had the best collection of Cape of Good Hope ever formed. And that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you.
Okay, you're giving my feedback.
The boss is back.
Sorry, he loved your presentation, Chris, and he was chomping at the bit.
Almost as good as mine.
All right, go to sleep. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, he got all excited about it, Chris. Thank you very much.
No problem. I can handle excitement.
But he can't. He sits there with that, he wants to jump in, and so anyway, and yeah, he doesn't do that often. He was bouncing more than the dog. Any other comments?
Chris, I just might mention, since we're on the topic of beryllium a little bit, when I was in the Air Force working with the B-52s, I had a toolkit that was made out of beryllium that we used whenever we worked in the fuel cells because, the characteristic of beryllium is it doesn't spark.
Yes, non-sparking tools, but they're made of copper beryllium.
It's true.
Rather than actually beryllium. So this is material that's only going to be, 1 1.5% beryllium, maybe. It's mainly copper, but yes, but the addition of that small amount of beryllium to copper tools, and then used for making tools makes them non-sparking. Yes, that's true. Yep.
Derek, welcome. You just have to unmute, Derek.
Thank you. Good night, friends. How are everyone tonight? Great. Listen, I have relocated from St. Lucia and I'm back in my homeland, Jamaica. So recently I met this fellow, Mike Blum. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. This chap works in Silicon Valley and has access to some really powerful equipment. And he has offered to do a transformed infrared spectroscopy to analyze the dyes that are used in original Cape of Good Hope stamps, comparing them to the fake Cape of Good Hope stamps. And he has access to the equipment and would love to share in a presentation to the group. This would help. I know people could come with, their various suspects or get them to him, and he would be able to identify them accurately if they are genuine or fake. And he could also tell you the makeup of the dyes that are used in the fake against the genuine. He also could do, he's using a lot of big words here, a stereoscopic microscope to do comparisons. And just that piece of equipment is like a $40,000 piece of equipment, precision, and that comes from Prague. But he's willing to share in a presentation if you would have him.
Oh, that would be wonderful, Derek. Let's connect offline, right, Rob?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll do that. Now I know, Chris, I know you're going to have to get going really soon. So if there's anything else, because I know you have a hard stop. So if anyone else has any comments for Chris, we're happy to forward them on. And you know where to find him. He's easy to find.
Yeah. I am, relatively speaking. So yeah, if anybody else has a question or a comment that they want me to hear, I'm happy to take it. But I got to get going here, actually, because believe it or not, I have a work meeting coming up here in just a little bit. So that's what happens when you work with a company in Japan. They think that 5 o'clock in the afternoon your time is a reasonable time for them. So that's the way it goes.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks, Chris. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
Douglas,
it was my pleasure.
Just a quickie, from the UK's point of view, the presentation and the discussion afterwards is well worth staying up till 1:10.
Well, thank you. Well, if you come to Boston, I'll make sure to buy everybody a round of drinks. How's that? And this is recorded, isn't this? So
it sounds good to me.
So, well, thank you, Douglas. Anything else, or should we let Chris go?
Oh, we can let Chris go. I just had a war story about someone who said he owed me a pint. So what was I drinking? And at the time I was drinking cognac, but I didn't take a pint of cognac because I wanted to be able to stand.
Wow. So Richard and Derek, I'm going to have you compare equipment here.
Yeah.
Is it like my spectrometer is more powerful than your spectrometer type thing? So.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to scoot. So thanks everyone. It was a pleasure getting to present, and thanks for the good questions and comments and everything. And so I'll look forward to getting in contact with some of you afterwards, and Richard, especially you, Richard Judge, to see what we can come up with. I sense another article coming on.
Yeah, and don't forget Derek's friend. So
yes,
we'll get everybody in touch there.
Yep, please
look forward to that.
Please do. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm
Thank you,
gonna
Chris.
run.
Chris.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. And thank you for everyone for attending.